There was only one opinion among us, from the commander-in-chief down to the latest recruit, about the attitude of the English fleet. We were convinced that it would seek out and attack our fleet the minute it showed itself, and wherever it was. This could be accepted as certain from all the lessons of English naval history, and the view was reinforced by the statement so often made on the English side that the boundaries of the operations of their fleet lay on the enemy's coasts. It was also confirmed by an earlier remark of the Civil Lord, Lee: "If it ever comes to war with Germany, the nation will wake up one morning and find it has possessed a fleet." All this pointed to the intention of making a quick and thorough job of it. Right up to the last moment in which there was the remotest possibility of keeping England out of the war, everything was avoided which could have provided a superficial excuse for the existence of a crisis. The Heligoland Bight was left open to traffic so far as it was not commanded by the guns of the island. Elsewhere, there was none which had sufficient range to stop traffic. We had never regarded it as possible that the English fleet would be held back from battle, and as a fleet in being, be restricted solely to blockading us from a distance, thereby itself running no risks. The test mobilization to which I have already referred, and the advanced stage of preparation thus involved, also seemed to indicate that offensive operations were to be expected immediately. This mobilization at the same time afforded a proof of the resolve of the English government, not to be afraid of increasing existing tension, and to add weight to the fleet, fully prepared for war, to concentrate on the concentration of the Russian armies. Now, why did I start today's Battle of Jutland Strategy of Leadership video by reading from Shear's book? Or rather, to be honest, this is actually Lambert and Faulkner's book, because they've put in an introduction and, to an extent, compiled it and modernised it for new readers. Germany's High Seas Fleet in the First World War by Admiral Reinhard Scheer. These are his own words. These are his own phrasing. And the introduction is well worth a read as well. Very much so. Why? Too often when we talk about the strategy in naval strategy in the First World War, we kind of leave the Germans out of it. And there is a good reason to do so. Their strategy is very reactive. As you can guess from that, their entire plan comes down to expecting the British to attack them. And pretty much everyone agreed to attack. The British were going to attack them. They had no strategy beyond that, though. And in a way, this is a fault of the two biggest names and biggest thinkers of the German Navy of this period. Holzendorf versus Tirpitz. For some reason, I've got Holzendorf versus Holzendorf. Now, in some ways, I should have probably left it as Holzendorf versus Holzendorf, because Tirpitz really doesn't have a strategy for the Navy. He has a building policy. He wants to build a Navy. He has an idea, a formula for the Navy to be this risk fleet. This formation which is going to be too big for the British to risk to go to war. He really doesn't think about what happens if they do go to war. So he's merrily building a fleet which is on paper supposed to be a great risk to the Royal Navy. And as I've discussed in other videos, ones that will have come out this week when this comes out, having a fleet and no strategy leads you to having issues. One of the big issues consistently, and this book does discuss that a lot, is that the British ships tend to have bigger guns and higher speeds. Now, yes, you can talk about the German guns being very capable because they tend to be longer barreled, and so that produces a slightly, it's not as simple as just one's 13.5 inch, one's 12 inch, so therefore the 13.5 inch must be better. It's more complicated, more nuanced. But they literally do work out. The British will use their speed and their range of firepower guns to fight a long-range bombardment in any battle. Yet there's no building to try and rectify this. They are dependent upon their torpedoes. They talk about how they are dependent upon their torpedoes and the speed of fire of their guns but they don't think through how they're going to properly do these things. Holzendorf is the man who does his best to try and build a strategy out of this. And he's been given a fleet which only really has one option for success against the Royal Navy. Find a small part of the Royal Navy, defeat it in detail, or bring the whole Royal Navy, whole Grand Fleet, into a battle as close to Germany as possible, whittle it down with his own forces, Junot style, and use his fleet to defeat them, and then hope that the North Sea and maybe submarines or other things, as they're going back across the North Sea, finishes off any damaged British ships, so that whilst his ships can make more quickly back into port, and can be repaired, which will hopefully redress the balance. Because, yeah, naval strategy is build strategy. If you haven't built the capabilities before the war begins, the odds are you're not going to get them during the wartime. You might be able to expand existing capabilities, but it's very difficult to get new capabilities in the middle of a war. Very difficult. And as I've talked about in videos when I've discussed the fleets of the Battle of Jutland and their construction, the German fleet is, well, it's kind of a mirage, but with substance. So let me explain before you start jumping on that keyboard and telling me, no, it wasn't. It's got a very strong battle line. Not the strongest of the Battle of Jutland. Let's be honest, the British have more battleships there alone at that battle than the Germans have any capital ships, pre-dreadnought battlecruiser or dreadnought battleship combined. The British have more. So build strategy, the British have definitely won that one. But the thing is, to get that number of capital ships, to get that force, you then look for the next level below, the cruisers. They do not have, by any stretch of the imagination, the same proportion of cruisers as the British do. The British have far more cruisers there. And they're more capable. The newest cruisers on the German side had actually been ordered by the Russians to replace their losses in the Russo-Japanese War. The only cruisers which have been built recently, which were available to operate with the High Seas Fleet, were these two Russian-ordered ships. Then it gets worse. Because then you look down and you look at their torpedo boats. And they're always smaller than the British ones. The British are building destroyers and they are solidly in the destroyer category by this point. The German ones are still torpedo boats. And the thing is, the destroyers are supposed to destroy torpedo boats and fight, and that's why they're called torpedo boat destroyers. They can act as torpedo boats because they have torpedoes on them, but they also got the guns to destroy torpedo boats. And so you want to fight between these two groups? That's fine. You know, the Germans, their vessels are quite good. But the thing is, they're smaller, they carry less firepower, and they're going to be less stable as gun platforms. But, okay. So they've got cruisers to support them? No. There are far more cruisers on the British side to support their light forces. So in terms of fleet action, the moment you get into kind of action where you're going to have the light forces released on either side, the British have an advantage. An overwhelming one. And this is all because, honestly, the person in charge of the build strategy of the German Navy hasn't been thinking about fighting a war. He's been thinking about winning the peace without winning it. Winning it from second place is his aim. Because his political limit is he can't spend too much money, or the army will dissolve the Navy. That's an honest worry they have, because the army comes first in the budget. Army always comes first in spending. And then this gentleman, Holzendorf. By the way, the two hate each other. It's really fun. The relationship between the two is they never get on. There is literally the number of officers who they both like is so few and far between. It basically begins and ends with Scheer and there's a couple of others who sort of at times fall into strategy, but literally Scheer is pretty much the only one who successfully works under both, and both give him glowing recommendations and support him. And that's another problem, because both of them are passionate and want someone to carry on their vision. So Scheer, for want of a better description of it, almost has split personality disorder as he tries to marry the vision of these two admirals in his head, and both of them are not good for Germany. Okay? They're not good. He is trying to make the best of the capabilities he has available, but honestly, he hasn't taken the opportunity to run proper war games and even actual exercises. War games would be the bare minimum, but he could have run whole fleet exercises, to test out the idea of what happens if the British don't. What happens if the British don't do what we think they're going to do? What happens if the British, it's all been bravado, it's all been part of a strategic ruse? What happens if the British are smarter than they're letting on, smarter than they're betraying themselves? What happens if what their statements have been are not their actual policy intents, but they are public statements to scare our political class and to try and remind them of their capability? They are politics to politics, not policy to policy. And that's where this book becomes really useful, because when you read it, you get a very good idea of what one of the most important minds of the period thought about his opponents. And yes, it's published post-war. Yes, a lot of it is justification. But what it does show is, fundamentally, the Germans really didn't understand the British. They really didn't. The more you read this book, and I have read it many times, I actually have read an earlier version, an earlier production of his memoirs as well. I'd say this is better in terms of easier to get hold of, and it's a good solid book. Definitely a good solid book. But it's, and this is sometimes hard to say, but it's the truth. It really does show there is a fundamental misunderstanding of the British going on. I'm not saying the British understand the Germans. They really don't. But the British have a far better understanding of the Germans than the Germans do of the British. It's not a high bar, though. It's really not a high bar to cross. It's really not. And this makes a lot of sense about what happens in the war and how they manage to achieve these things, because honestly, both sides, certain commanders give their opponents credit and actually give them agency in their mind and imagine they might make decisions. But in terms of the German senior command, the idea of someone not following through their plan seems to almost not occur. And I think that's honestly because if they imagine any different situation, then they have to accept that they might lose. And that is something they cannot do. Especially not at this point in the war. Especially not prior to the Battle of Jutland. I think it's only something which really comes in after the Battle of Jutland they start to accept it, because that explains so many decisions and how their thinking on submarine warfare, and especially all these things, evolve. Especially Hulsendorf's opinion on submarine warfare evolves after Jutland. And Scheer himself as well, because prior to that, they're only allowing themselves to think a certain way because they can't imagine themselves losing. Because if they do, that is too dark a thought. Which brings us on to the British naval strategy pre-war. And for those thinking I'm going to be saying this is amazing, I apologise now, you're going to be sorely disappointed. Now, whenever I talk about strategy of the Royal Navy at the beginning of World War I and prior to World War I, people talk to me about Fisher. Fisher is great at statements, those same statements which mean the Germans are very sure that the British are just going to charge and attack them. Fisher is Great at coming up with ideas and interesting things to build, not always thinking through their consequences. I'd argue the battle cruiser, two-word, the original form, what was originally called the Dreadnought Armoured Cruiser and then became the Battle Cruiser, is one of those. Because, yeah, let's build a ship which has cruiser-grade armour to fight cruisers, but it's going to have capital ship-grade guns. It's going to have battleship-grade guns. And yeah, that's of course going to be a great combination. No one is going to think, well, hang on, what happens if I build a ship exactly the same? And then we've got two ships which are sledgehammers, sledgehammer armed walnuts. Okay, and then someone thinks, well, hang on, why don't I upgrade my walnut a bit to a conker or something, slightly heavier, and maybe that will be able to take maybe a glancing blow from the sledgehammer, giving it more chance to kill the enemy walnut. I don't know. He doesn't seem to think that through, and he even World War One, when he gets the Renown and Repulse, and don't get me started on Courageous, Glorious, and Furious, the same idea is going through his head. He hasn't evolved. He's sure his idea is right. He's sure his idea is right. What you need is more speed, bigger guns, more speed, bigger guns. And he's got Tiger literally sitting there right in front of him going, hello, I'm a perfect example of what you should be building. But no, he doesn't take any notice of it. Mainly because Tiger, for one of the better font, is the font of more Jellicoe and others' involvement. And they are not as pure, I suppose, as he is. He's a purist in terms of his view of what things should be. But realistically, the strategy for the Royal Navy has for a long time been, we're going to do a distant blockade. The whole investment in Scapa Flow, the whole development of the basing, the whole infrastructure being built, that shows exactly what the British are planning on doing, honestly. It really does. It's one of the interesting things that the Germans don't pick up on the infrastructure the British are building. They literally do cruises almost every year to Norway from 1909 onwards. And they don't seem to notice what the British are doing with Scapa Flow. They don't seem to register into their minds as part of their strategic planning of, why build a base there? Why are the British building a base there if they're going to charge and attack you wherever you are? Surely they can do that more easily from Portsmouth, from Plymouth, from Chatham, from the bases they already have. The base had literally been British policy since 1904. It's the bases there before the dreadnoughts. And that's the history of going on. But realistically, the strategy that the British are employing does not come from people like the First Sea Lord. It does not come from Fisher. No. The strategy actually comes from people like Louis Baderberg, or, more importantly, Rear Admiral Henry Oliver. They are the head of the Naval Intelligence Division. And Naval Intelligence Division in the Royal Navy, pretty much especially as the Royal Navy doesn't have a staff, that as we'd conventionally call it, with the role of the staff of carrying out briefings of politicians, etc., and members of Parliament in comparison to the Army. The Naval Intelligence Division takes on a lot of the role of a staff. They are the ones who provide the operational planning, because they get all the information together. They're already providing all the information, they're just also working on the other side. So, consistently, the leaders and the heads of the Naval Intelligence Division are the ones who are coming up with the pre-war strategy, with the strategies for how to do things. The trouble is, because they're not a staff, there is a massive disconnect between them and the government. And this is what leads to some of the issues with the government's information and ability to operate, because the information has to go up from them to people like the First Sea Lord. And the First Sea Lord, well, they often have a policy of, we don't want to share this with politicians because they'll leak it. Why would we tell them? They'll just tell everyone else what we're doing. The trouble is, when you're trying to persuade a politician to endorse and back your policy, it's kind of difficult to do if you won't actually tell them what you're doing it for and how you're going to do it. They tend to want answers. They tend to want to feel in the know, feel included, they want to feel, for want of better terminology, ownership. participation. They want to feel like they are a stakeholder, to use all that lovely modern language. And that causes a problem. Now, the Royal Navy still managed to produce a fairly balanced fleet. Mostly thanks to the demands of the Empire and being able to show, well, we need cruisers for obvious reasons, cruising around the Empire, doing all the protection against surface raiders and the threats to the, our wider interests. Of course we need cruisers. And that goes to the battle cruisers as well. That's what we need them. We need a battle fleet, obviously, because everyone else has one and we have to be the biggest navy in the world. So honestly, the Royal Navy is kind of given a bit of a get-out-of-jail-free card because Britain is a maritime empire dependent upon its naval power for its internal lines of communication over its wide and disparate empire. But that doesn't always help them, because the trouble is there's a lot of people trying to build a strategy, and Britain has some advantages, but leaders like Jackie Fisher don't always play to them. They don't always think about the wider strategy. I would argue this is the classic case with the battle cruisers. There is a good reason for them. They are sensible ships to build in many, many regards, but they lose their purpose very quickly, and you could see that coming. So what you needed to do was always to arm them slightly better than they were. In the nicest way, there is the great version eventually that comes about with Vanguard, but actually you can see in sort of the F3 designs, produced immediately post-World War I, of the fully armoured battlecruiser, where it has battlecruiser grade subdivision internally, but far better, far more armour coverage, and so it's battleship grade coverage. Because the difference between the two, and this is something which I have to probably discuss again in this video, but I've discussed it in a lot of other videos, is not just how thickness of armour. Okay, that's always the thing. If we have battlecruiser 2 words on this side, and let's say they're the Invincible class battlecruisers. Okay, they're battlecruiser 2 words, dreadnought armour cruisers. Then you have battlecruiser 1 words, things like Tiger, things like a lot of the German the battle cruisers. Then you have fast battleships, let's say sort of the Iowas, and then you have full battleships. Now the difference between them is not just power in terms of the engine and sometimes length, but it's also density. As you're going up, they get denser. The subdivision gets greater. So there's more and more subdivisions, so they have more and more compartments in a certain amount of space. They are more and more go from basically being a set of lozenges to a honeycomb. And one of the advantages of this grey subdivision is it gives you more positions that you can hang the armour off, so you can actually provide better armour coverage. So a battleship and a battle cruiser might be, the posters going, they both have 13 inches of armour. But the 13-inch armour belt on a battlecruiser might be very, very thin and only cover this much of the hull. Whereas the 13 inches on a battleship might cover this much of the hull. If I get my second hand in here somewhere. Should really move the camera. It covers the whole thing. And that's the difference. It's the subdivision and it's the armour coverage that really defines where they fall on that scale. Which is why you get into some fun debates, especially with things like the Congos, which start out as pretty well-armoured battle cruiser 1 words. And in the case of possibly 2 of them, thanks to the differences in their upgrade process and their rebuilds, gain enough subdivision, they possibly cross the line into fast battleships. That's an argument which me and, if you don't know him, it's become some surprise, one of my best friends, Naval, who's in the shipshape crew with me, have on quite a regular basis, whether or not those 2 Congos do cross the line, because it all depends on how you rate the subdivision, basically. It all depends on how you rate that. Now, some people add in, oh yes, there's gun differentials and these things, but honestly, the gun differentials are more often to do with industrial issues than anything else. For example, when we get to World War II, the Scharnhorst class, Scharnhorst and Eisenhower, they have 11-inch guns not because they're battle cruisers, they're not, they're fast battleships. They have 11-inch guns because those are the biggest guns that Germany can at that point produce, and to give them anything bigger, they'd have to delay their service entry date. So they go with the triple 11-inch turrets, planning to later upgrade them to 15s. They are fast battleships. That is what they are, like the Dunkirks. But it's also why when we're talking about the German battlecruisers of this era, we know they're not fast battleships because of their subdivision, because of their armour coverage. They might look like it on the surface, if you're saying, well, compared to the Invincibles, but the Invincibles are battlecruiser 2 words. And that ultimately is their problem. They are battlecruiser 2 words. They are not, and should never have been anywhere near a battle like Jutland. There's actually an argument as to whether things like HMS Tiger, and to an extent the Big Cats, should have been anywhere near them either, but should have been anywhere near that battle either, but to be honest, they have more of a chance. They actually have some armour. They actually have a lot greater subdivision. That's really the big difference between a battle cruiser, 1 word, and 2 words, is usually more subdivision. And that subdivision can have a massive impact on a ship's survivability. If we consider today, when we look at modern warships and modern shipbuilding, a lot of the ships' survivability is based on their subdivision, is based on them having multiple redundant systems, is based on them having this wide spread of capabilities within the hull, which is also one of the reasons why when people do simulations with this great idea of let's make a distributed network of ships that, are smaller and all have different components so they'll be more survivable, and they find out, well, hang on, they're not actually, and actually there's more problems with making those ships survivable, and it actually works out as more difficult than the larger hulls, which have more space for survivability built within them. But that's modern issues. Now, how to employ the fleet is realistically something which the Naval Intelligence Division have been working out for a long time, and going for a distant blockade of Germany makes a lot of sense. Now, the thing is, the distant blockade was always going to take time, but blockade always took time. Blockade is a slow kill of an opponent. It always has been, it always will be. The thing is, Britain's an island nation, it waits out. It uses its dominant sea power to continue trading, keeping its economy going, and it basically hires continental armies to do the fighting. That's the traditional British strategy. World War I, it was decided that the traditional British strategy of a small army was no longer good enough. We had to go for a large army, and that's a whole debate we get into. Actually, when we start the war, the army isn't that massive. It is basically traditional style, but it looked bad. We were participating in this war and we weren't doing anything other than blockading the enemy and sitting off blockading them. And so you needed to get involved. But why had the Royal Navy gone with a distant blockade strategy? Literally because they were looking at the German capabilities and going, minefields and torpedo boats. That's a good way for us to throw away our advantage. Let's make them come to us. In fact, the British plan was to impose a distant blockade, force the Germans to have to try and break that blockade, and then when they are their side of the North Sea, on their side of the North Sea definitely, and fighting away with a large formation which can't run away, smash them with everything they've got. In simple terms, both sides were like boxers who decided the way to win this match is to make our opponent come into our corner and then pummel them. There is a lot of similarity going on here, and as I said, the British have a slightly better understanding of the Germans than the Germans do of the British. But that's not a high bar to jump over on the German that the Germans are providing, and it doesn't mean the British are doing particularly well. It just means it's a slightly better, in that the British have worked out that they are going to have to wait for the Germans to do it, that the Germans aren't going to do it immediately. The Germans are going to build up, that the blockade is going to get worse and worse, and then eventually the Germans are going to be forced to break the blockade. So the British are always expecting it to take at least a couple of years. But the thing is, if they'd looked at the German ships, their ranges, their capabilities, the Germans have built their ships with the idea of fighting close to Germany, and that affects a lot of their radius and range of operations and their ability to project their power. And when you start looking at the British idea of where they were going to fight, there's no chance of the Germans ever fighting there because they can't get enough force there to actually be prepared to fight there in the first place. So, if the British had looked at the Germans' range of operations and radius of operations in terms of their fuel bunkerage and what they could carry with them, they'd have realised their own plan couldn't work. It's just, it's a cacophony of errors on both sides, and it really doesn't get any better during the war. It doesn't get any better during the war. So let's consider the Germans during the war. Poor Frederick von Ingenol. How to use the fleet. How to use the fleet when you have a Kaiser who has built the fleet based on the idea that that would deter Britain ever going to war for them. The whole idea, let's be clear, of the risk fleet theory. And I know there are going to be some people probably in the comments who are going to be going, but no, the Germans have the right to build a fleet. They do have a right to build a fleet. No nation says they don't. But the trouble is, the moment you're building a fleet, when you're the world's largest and probably most powerful land power, and you start building a fleet, which is stated as its aim, and before people say it's not stated, it is, especially in discussions with the British discussions in terms of Tirpitz's signalling, is to be strong enough that and this is paraphrasing, I will admit, that the British won't risk war with you because they'll lose too many ships and everyone else will destroy them. You're now going to make everyone uneasy. For Britain, who is your traditional ally, who has traditionally worked with you, why do you feel the need to suddenly have such a massive fleet? Even if you weren't building it against Britain, if you think about that from your ally, it's kind of like if you have a partnership between two companies, and one company does the road haulage and one company does the train haulage, right? And suddenly the train company starts buying trucks. The road haulage firm is going to look at that company and go, why are you doing this? We're friends, we're allies. You're now competing with us on our stage. Oh, no, it's better for our business, it's more sense. Well, it is more sensible for your business, but now you are now turned from an ally into a competitor. And that's the really interesting thing, which doesn't always seem to commute across when we're talking about this. There is a discussion from both sides sometimes. The British going, we don't know why they've done it. Well, of course they're going to do it. Of course the Germans are going to do it, because that's the next level for them to rise to an even greater power status. They have to build a fleet. So of course they're going to do it. But you also can't expect Britain to sit there and go, oh, that's a nice thing. We're happy for you. They're not going to. It's not in their strategic interest to do so. So this is a natural consequence of them following that. Now, the Germans could have chosen not to. They could have chosen to focus on land and economic and commercial success. They could have gone for a capitalist empire. But that wasn't really the thinking at the time, because they were still, broadly speaking, in the throes of mercantilism. That was still the framework which most nations were thinking through, was still very much mercantilist. Okay, and mercantilist prioritizes the control of territory, and the control of resources, and the control of people as the root of all financial wealth. Very simply, okay? I'm not getting into the full debate of mercantilism versus capitalism today. It's just the basics and moving on. And so you now got this leadership which is putting down rules of operation based still on that assessment, and you've got an enemy who isn't doing the one thing which would allow you to possibly win. And you now have to figure this out. What do you do? What do you do? Well, to be honest, you start raiding. But there are problems with that as a tactic. You start the submarine warfare, but there are problems again with that as a tactic. No one's ever done a submarine war before. What rules do you follow? Do you follow the rules of cruisers? Do you invent new rules? That's going to be very, very bad karma on the international diplomatic stage if you start sinking ships without telling them. It's always been traditional the ships know that there's an enemy coming to sink them, and they get a chance to get the civilians off and all these things. So if you're not going to allow that, that's going to cause issues. That's going to cause problems. And, well, then with the battle fleet and carrying out raiding operations to try and lure a section of the Royal Navy out, how do you do it? Well, probably use the scouting group, because that's your battle cruisers. First scouting group, you get faster ships, you do raid on them. Where do you raid? Now, this is always the fun thing, because sometimes people ask me, how do the Germans select targets for where to raid? And quite literally, this is our radius of operation. These are targets in that radius of operation which we are likely to run into too much issues. These are targets which are not valuable enough that anyone's going to really care about it. And these are the targets which are valuable enough that people are going to care if we hit them, and are not so well defended that we're going to run into trouble and possibly be held up there long enough for the British to actually, the Royal Navy, to get down to us in force. Because remember, the point is we want to be able to pull back and engage a portion of the enemy fleet, the battle cruisers, etc., especially. Engage them, overwhelm them, and then slowly work our way through the Royal Navy to reduce its numbers so that we can then match it in battle, engage it, and possibly succeed. We need to mitigate its numerical advantage, and the best way we can do that is by attriting it, by chipping away at it. Submarines are one methodology, but they're not going to attrit it enough. We need to attrit it in force. And also the added bonus of, if that succeeds, we win a victory, which gives us a moral victory and gives us a morale boost and a glory we can talk about. And it's successful. It's successful until it isn't. And the reason it's successful until it isn't is because when it first happens, the British Naval Intelligence Division are a bit surprised, honestly. They've been watching and tracking German codes and German information room 40s working on it. And they're honestly kind of going, what's happening? What's happening? Signals traffic analysis hasn't really been developed as much as it will be in the interwar periods at this point. And it's one of the really weird things when we talk about it, that actually more usable data in terms of intelligence comes in more quickly. Not from reading the enemy codes, but from analysing the volume and direction of signals. I.e., the sheer number of signals and where they're coming from usually tells you far quickly about what the enemy's doing than cracking their code. Because cracking their code takes time, whereas you can get a fairly quick readout of, wow, there's a lot of enemy signals coming from this direction here, and they seem to be moving in that direction. Okay, so there's a large enemy formation going that way. Let's move to adjust. You can do that pretty quickly. And that's a very, again, simplistic explanation of signals traffic analysis, but it's part of an overall discussion. Eventually, I will do a video about signals traffic analysis, but I have to first of all find some decent books to talk about it, that actually talk about it in a way which I can spread to a wider audience. There really aren't that many good books about signals traffic analysis. There just aren't. The Germans are helping everyone at this point to understand them, because they do have this habit of transmitting on full volume all the time. And there are reasons for that. There are reasons they transmit at full power. They want to make sure they're heard. They want to make sure the signals get through. They're always worried about reception of it. And you can understand that to an extent with the radios and systems at the time, but still it does make certain operations easier to track. once the British start cracking not the code, but the program of German operations, that is what leads to things like the Battle of Dogger Bank, where the Germans once again were planning to ambush a useful target, something which was both exposed, of value, minimally guarded because of what it had to be. The British fishing vessels in Dogger Bank. Now, again, they should probably have asked the Russians about this, but at this point they were still fighting them. Russians would have told them that actually attacking fishing vessels in Dogger Bank does not need to lead to good responses, and doesn't lead them to good, well, let's say karma because of the Battle of Tsushima. But still, the Germans go for Dogger Bank. And this is a very attractive raid because it's very close to Germany, realistically, and they can attack it and can get back, but it gets cracked, and so the British know they're coming. The codes, the signals all get detected, they know they're coming, and the battlecruiser fleet is there. The battlecruiser squadrons are there. The Harwich force is there. And that's bad, because that means you've got the Royal Navy's night-fighting close-quarter specialists of the destroyers and light cruisers of the Harwich force, and you've got the battle cruisers, and you've got as many battle cruisers as they can get together, realistically, that were available. Lion, Tiger, Princess Royal, New Zealand, Indomitable. The Germans lose Blucher. They could have lost a lot more, but Beatty and his communications saved them. What is interesting at this point is that technically the British are ambushing the ambush. And that should have probably keyed off the Germans there was something problematic going on. What they actually decided was that it was the fishy neutrals, which they'd been suspecting in the Dogger Bank area, had sent word to the British early enough, seeing them coming, and fishing boats had given away their position, had told the British that they were on their way. And so they ignore it. So their strategic idea is still therefore carrying on. This idea of we can raid into certain areas, we can draw a small British force, and then we can ambush it. We can ambush it. It didn't work. It didn't work. This raid was supposed to be conducted in such a way that it would attack the fishing boats, cause damage, and then force the British to post a larger formation to the Dogger Bank there in future and maintain ships there in rotation, which would wear out the British ships, leave them open to submarine attack, and also allow the fleet to a high seas fleet to select its own point and attack and overwhelm them. It was a lovely, well thought through plan, but it requires on surprise, and it requires your enemy playing ball. To be fair, the enemy did sort of play ball, but not in the way they were expecting. The British strategy changes, well, they mostly come about at the beginning of the war, and are mostly thanks to this handsome gentleman here called Winston Churchill, who, well, love him or hate him, think he's great, think he's terrible, he is a human, and he has many good points, and he has many bad points. And he can both identify as a problem for the enemy and as a problem for you, and sometimes that's in the same breath. Unfortunately, in the meetings at the beginning of World War I, when he was supposed to be defending the Navy's strategy to a cabinet which had invited a lot more generals than they had admirals, he doesn't. But there again, that's probably because he doesn't even understand the Royal Navy strategy, because I'm fairly certain no one's really explained it to him. Because Fisher was his buddy, and everyone expected Fisher to explain it to him. The trouble is, Fisher doesn't like explaining strategies to politicians, even ones he likes. So what was the strategy? What was the British strategy over and above the distant blockade and the long war? Well, it was probably to use, and there seems to be discussions, but the thing is, They've built no ships. They've acquired no assets. And to be fair, amphibious doctrine at the time didn't require acquiring specialist vessels. And they do, as soon as war begins, start hoovering up anything which looks like a monitor or inshore support fire support vessel. So perhaps that counts. But probably it seems to be the intention was to try and launch the army, the British Army, with Royal Marines and naval landing parties, probably behind a line somewhere. I know Fisher's plan, he was always talking about, was to get into the Baltic, to force the Straits, get into the Baltic, and then start causing trouble with Germany, and maybe help land Russian soldiers on the Baltic coast of Germany. But it doesn't seem like a sensible idea to do with the British Army. There is quite a strong possibility that the Royal Navy was thinking Napoleonic-style raiding with the British Army. There's also a strong possibility they were thinking about having them land at points in Schleswig-Holstein, in certain parts of Germany, or maybe even if the Germans had pushed far enough and actually pushed the Netherlands into the Netherlands. There are options, but basically landing the British Army behind the lines. There again, the British Army's plan was, of course, to go to France and fight alongside the French and get some martial glory that way, because they were a proper army and they would do proper army things by fighting a proper enemy, instead of just imperial policing. And they'd spent years explaining that to people. They really had. Whereas the Navy hadn't thought it needed to. Honestly, the Royal Navy from about 1880 onwards is one of the most conceited organisations till you get into the 1920s that you've ever dealt with. They honestly do not believe they need to explain themselves at all to anyone, because they've never had to. The generation of officers who had to explain themselves, who had to explain the value of sea power, had come and gone. The officers who came after them, well, everyone understood the value of sea power. This is the Royal Navy. This is what the Empire rests on. So we don't need to explain it. And by the time you get, even when you're talking about the admirals in the 1900s and 1910s, some of them do some pretty good jobs of trying to justify procurement and getting procurement through. But they don't really explain the value of sea power. That's one of the reasons why the Royal Navy loves Julian Corbett so much. And Alfred Fair Mahan. They can't do it themselves, so they've got people who are going to do it for them. They'll do it for them. And that's the important thing. And it really is important, because it's a skill to communicate and act as the interface between people who are, let's say, of the naval side or the military side and the civilian world. And for a long time, those worlds have been very close to each other. And there are periods, even through the last century, where those worlds were very close to each other. But as time goes on, they get further apart. And the thing is, Churchill here, God love him, he's a cavalry officer, a junior cavalry officer. That's his training. That's what he was taught to be. He's a journalist. He's a bit of a history buff. But all these things do not mean he suddenly understands naval theory and naval strategy and is going to be able to parrot it. There is the classic case of when he's standing at the dispatch boxes talking about the naval budget that year. He basically says, if Germany chooses not to procure it, we won't procure it. He makes the entire Royal Navy's procurement about Germany. When the Royal Navy's procurement wasn't entirely about Germany, because there might be the quantitative race going on with Germany, but there's a qualitative race going on with America, Japan, and Italy, with notable mention of Austria-Hungary. That's the qualitative race going on, and that the Royal Navy needs to win just as much, and needs to be just as much in a part of, as it does the quantitative race. Because, again, the Empire depends upon the Royal Navy. And as war goes on, as the war has gone on, honestly, the British political class has become less and less sure of what the Navy's doing, because whilst it makes sense for the Navy to be doing this distant blockade, where are the victories? Where are the battles? Why are we not hanging about off the enemy coast? Well, Navy's going, well, because that'd be stupid and we get killed and there's no value in that. Then we'll lose control of the sea. But no one understands that because no one's explained that. They've been explaining the Age of Sail. They've been using the Age of Sail history to justify the Navy. And now the Navy's not acting like an Age of Sail Navy because, to be truthful, the speed and range of engagement has increased to such a point that it isn't sensible to act like an Age of Sail Navy with an inshore blockade. Because an inshore blockade in this part would be a risk. Ever since the June Coal, it's not been sensible to carry out an inshore blockade. Doesn't mean you've had to. The Royal Navy controls key strategic choke points around the world. They can soon cut off anyone's trade anywhere in the world they want to. And they will do. But that's not what the politicians have been sold. That's not what the public have been sold. And this is one of the problems leading up to the Battle of Jutland. Because the British public and the British political class aren't expecting to retain control of the sea and command the sea as a win. They want to decimate the enemy. They want to decimate them. That's what they're looking for. With that being said, it's Shameless Book Plug time now. So, Shameless Book Plug. What is the Shameless Book Plug? What is it about? What am I plugging? Well, I'm plugging my book, Travels, Battles and Darings. Published by Pen and Sword a couple of years ago. There are more books coming out soon, but I've moved house, I've done all sorts of weird things, and so, yeah. So those who've watched this channel will tell you it has been fun, but more books are coming soon. They're going to be self-published, Kindle Direct Publishing, because I fancy seeing if that is maybe the future of historical publishing, because for all the copies sold, you don't get a lot of money, and I don't hold that against the publishing company. They need to make a profit, they need to pay their staff, they need to do so many different things. So I don't hold it against them, it's just I'd like to see more money coming back for my work. I'd like to see a greater percentage come my way. So I want to see if KDP works for me. And then after that, I might try other methods of it. But I want to do KDP first because it's fairly simple, fairly straightforward, and it doesn't require much specialist knowledge to be able to do correctly, it would seem. But, yeah, this is the part where I get to say thank you to all of you, where I get to sort of say, without you liking, sharing, subscribing, without you making that bell solid on the subscribe button down there, I wouldn't be here. Without you doing that, it just wouldn't be the case. It's one of the enduring things I find interesting about my channel is that I have such an even mix of viewers, that I have such a returning base of viewers, but there are still a significant portion of return viewers who are not subscribed. And I'm really surprised about that. When I find out that 45% of my returning viewers who've watched more than 3 or more episodes from me in the last 28 days are not subscribed. I don't know why. I'd like you to be subscribed. There's lots more content coming, and it's always good, and technically I'd like you to be subscribed because there's a bet between my mother and aunt over me getting to 20,000 subscribers by Christmas, and if I get there, then my mum gets a spa day paid for by my aunt. They are twin sisters, non-identical twin sisters, and you should note that my mum, if she loses, has to bake a cake for my aunt, and they've considered that's the fair equity, because my mum's very good at baking cakes, and my aunt is offering to pay for a spa day. So, that's why I'm trying to push forward. So thank you. Thank you for your support. Thank you for all the support. The liking, the shares, the super chats, super thanks, all the memberships, the patrons, and when this goes live, the patron vote should be live. And thank you for all that, because you're what makes this possible. And the Patreon vote will be cool. I'd like to see who wins that and what wins, because there's some good ideas coming from that. For example, on I think Saturday this week, when this comes out, there is going to be a video which is basically asking me what I think, from a naval perspective, Australia, Canada, and Britain should do should America go full isolationist. And whilst I don't think that's going to happen, I really don't. As I've said in other videos, you always plan for the worst case scenario and prepare for it and hope for the best. And the worst case scenario for many powers in the world is America going completely isolationist, because it means the backstop that they rely on to be another sort of guarantor of their security and their ability to communicate with the wider world and the free trade economic market as we have defined it, and the global maritime trade as we have defined it, is America. And so America going isolationist would put all that in jeopardy. So what would you do? Because that's what your economies, that's what your nations actually depend on. So if you don't have a plan, if you haven't at least given it some thought, and the unthinkable happened, then you're very, very bad at your job. You have to at least consider these things. It's completely unlikely. So it's a fun one for me to think about, because it's kind of, I'm able to apply historical planning and historical foresight, but again, it's going to be, I am worried about some people expecting me to say I want Britain to build up 12 carrier battle groups or something like that. No, that's not a sensible option. There are things you need to do. There are certainly, but mostly it's going to be working with programs that are existing and developing from them. But still, it's an interesting thing to look into and consider, and yeah, I'm looking forward to doing it. But yes, let's talk about the actual German plan for Jutland, shall we? So the German plan was quite simple. They would have submarines, because they weren't currently using them for the economic warfare, because prize rules have been declared, and that was considered suicidal. So they had submarines around all the bases they could, and they would act as both a warning measure and a screening measure, sort of finning the British as they come out. And the first scouting group would bombard Sunderland. And the idea was then the battlecruiser fleet would race to engage them, and then the first scouting group would lure them under the guns of the High Seas Fleet, and they would be destroyed. Now, we'll just point out one small issue with this plan. Just one small issue. The British ships are noticeably faster than their German counterparts, and especially faster than their battle line German counterparts. And whilst you often the first you really realise you have a massive enemy fleet around you is when you hear the first bombardment ring out and see the horizon turn into a wall, a cliff of flashes and smoke and coming towards you. First round hits are kind of rare. First salvo hits are kind of rare. And if they then turn around and run away, they will probably get away. So you would end up with some potential victory in terms of you made them run away, but the odds of you actually getting a killing blow were unlikely. But still, it was a chance. And if you can take out the battlecruiser fleet, that's a significant portion. That's a significant portion of the Royal Navy, forgetting, of course, the fact that they actually have more battleships just at Jutland. That's not in total, because in total they have even more, because they're off in maintenance and you're actually waiting for Jutland to when you've got the most ships available, whereas the Royal Navy's just come with what they have available as normal. The Royal Navy has more battleships at Jutland than the Germans have capital dreadnoughts, pre-dreadnoughts, let's call them, for the sake of ease of us. I prefer to call them Royal Sovereign style battleships, but I also prefer to call them pre-dreadnoughts, and that's the name which is stuck so far, but I will keep working on calling them Royal Sovereign style battleships and battle cruisers. So yeah, you take out the battle cruiser fleet, you're going to upset them. Admittedly, you're then immediately going to make 5th Battle Squadron the fast wing of the Royal Navy, but the Germans didn't seem to understand that 5th Battle Squadron was then with the battle cruisers. What can I say? They had some information issues. It's an interesting time. It truly is. But honestly, the German plan for Jutland was quite a good one, realistically. It was making the best of their opportunities, and if they pulled it off, great. If they didn't pull it off, then they've embarrassed the British by attacking Sunderland. Again, it's Sunderland. I personally wouldn't choose to attack it. I've met people from Sunderland. They bear a grudge. A long one. And they never forget. But, you know, if you're the Germans, you might not have that level of cultural awareness about England. They might not. And let's contrast with the British plan for Jutland. In contrast, the British plan for Jutland seems almost simple. And it's their whole concept of operations, realistically. Any German attack detected by submarine, actual attack on the mainland, or by intelligence, will be prosecuted by battle cruisers charging out to find them, the battle cruiser force charging out to find them, and the ground fleet coming along behind that. Should the battle cruiser fleet find a scouting group, they engage, follow, and harass. Should they find anything they cannot defeat, they are to withdraw onto the ground fleet. It is a very simple, very brutal plan. It requires only two things to work coherently. One, the battle cruiser force, the battle cruiser fleet, keeps the ground fleet appraised of their positioning and the situation they're in, whether by broadcasting that to home and home retransmitting it so as not to reveal the position of the ground fleet, or alternatively whether by ensuring some communication link themselves through low-powered links through a cruiser line. There are options, should that be possible. Keeping that communication is the vital thing, because that allows the ground fleet to be there to ensure that you don't get overwhelmed. And principally their plan was to rely upon their speed and firepower to get them into and out of trouble as they needed to. And this is why I do tend to say this battle is a battle of both sides ambushing each other, because the battle cruiser fleet finds first scouting group, chases them to the high seas fleet. The high seas fleet then chases the battle cruiser fleet to the ground fleet. And what's really funny, and this is why I say the English, the British, just ever so slightly understand their opponents better than their opponents understand them, is that at no point, and this book makes a very interesting, illuminating read on that front, at no point does someone seem to consider, what happens if the British are planning to ambush us like we were planning to ambush them? No, they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't do that, would they, really? Now, seeing as we're not talking about the 1916 bombardment of Sunderland, we're not, there is obviously a point at which the Germans don't get that far. And despite the issues, and there were issues with intelligence, mainly because some bright spark had just ordered the creation of a staff, and they'd basically done it by transferring people out of Naval Intelligence Division and forming a staff. And there was a whole disagreement about how they were going to set up, and this was literally done on the eve of war. And in fact, so much of it was done after war had begun. So it was a confused mess, to say the least. To say the least, the Admiralty was still, even in 1916, had a lot of overlapping jurisdictions and officers who were sure they were in charge of all sorts of things. It was a mess. Anyway, Despite all the intelligence snafus and the issues whereby, the information that poor Jellicoe would suffer from, uh, the information did get out that the Germans were coming out. The fleet moved to engage them. One of the things you note from the positioning and manoeuvring of this force, when you look at it, when you really look at it, is they're supposed to be aiming for Sunderland? Really? Sunderland? Look at this map. You can see Sunderland. They're heading nowhere near it. And there's a reason for that. One is getting out through the minefields. One is their organisation, but also there's their arc. And the fact of the angle they want to manoeuvre at and how they want to attack Sunderland. We can also see why they're going for Sunderland. It almost guarantees that the battle cruiser fleet should get to them first, and they hope that will give them time. That will give them time to engage them and destroy them. But they don't get that. They don't get that at all. Instead, they bump into Beatty. And Beatty goes, "Hello!" And you have to remember at this point, Beatty is still feeling like, well, that Hipper made him look an idiot at Dogger Bank. That he had the chance to literally decimate First Scouting Group, and all he got was the Blucher. And it, of course, is not his fault. It's not his communications error. It's not his staff's fault. It's nothing to do with him's fault. No, it's entirely Hipper. And he's got to get a bit of revenge there. But even if there hadn't been revenge, it's no surprise that Beatty follows Hipper, because honestly, Beatty has the tactical sense of a dog chasing a ball. He really does. He's got a target in front of him, he's going to engage. He doesn't do the whole communication thing he's supposed to, really. And when he does, he often manages to get it going confused. But the thing is, he's following Hipper. And that's great. The Germans are going, plan's going to work. Slowly coming up, shears come up. And then, boom! And the trouble is, what does Beatty do? Beatty turns away. And he starts running north. It's called literally the run to the north. He forgets to tell 5th Battle Squadron about it for a bit, but they soon work it out themselves when they see the entire High Seas Fleet coming up on them, and they're going, "Okay, Warspite, you might want to fight that entire fleet solo, you might want to, but the rest of us don't. So come here, let's go." And they go north. And the thing is, Beatty never really considered the fact he was going south that he might bump into the High Seas Fleet. That's part of the plan, but he doesn't really think he's going to, and then when he does, okay, go north. At this point, the Germans are in a tail chase with a faster force. It's the most stupid thing you could do. But it's their first chance in years to actually get a meaningful lump out of the Royal Navy. So they're going to chase them down. They're going to hunt them down. That's why they don't think that there's the Grand Fleet coming. Because they finally got their chance to actually do what they've been aiming to do for years. Destroy a large chunk of the Royal Navy's fleet. And yes, what are they depending on for that to happen? Well, honestly, the Queen Elizabeths are faster than their fleet are and are keeping handily ahead of them. They're honestly hoping they catch something. Probably it's the Queen Elizabeths. If they could have taken them out by en masse, it would have been worth it. They'd have probably lost a fair number of ships doing it, but they would have probably have done it. Because actually pummeling the Queen Elizabeths into the water at that time, you could do it with the ships they had. There's no discrepancy there, but actually accomplishing it was going to take a lot of probably take a lot of their ships with them, because pummeling a ship to the point at which it's destroyed takes time. At this point, the guidance and the ranging and the fire control is nowhere near what it'll be in World War Two. It's nowhere near what it'll be in 1918, a little at this point. That's the thing. Fire control after Jutland takes a massive leap forward. There is so much investment put into it. One of the many things which the result of Jutland is blamed upon is fire control, but we'll leave that to one side. And they run into the Grand Fleet, which is literally their worst scenario. They have to complete 2 battle turns away to break contact. They have to fight through the night. And yes, honestly, they are saved in that night engagement, because if the Harwich force had actually been joined up with the Grand Fleet, as it should have been sensibly by, if anyone sensible was in charge, had realised, hang on, we've got the meeting engagement we've always wanted. It should have been, the order to the Harwich force should have been, go, head north, head north, head north. There is a battle going on. And when one of the times when the Germans break south to try and get away, they'd probably run into the Harwich force in daytime. That would have made their break south interesting. They'd have probably still managed to break their way through, but goodness knows what the Harwich force would have done to them on the way through, and that would probably slow them down enough that the Grand Fleet would have been on them. But that's the British strategic failure. And that's happening down in London. That's the Admiralty failing to see that this is a meeting engagement. You send everything you've got. And part of the reason why they're not sending everything they've got is because we've got the Grand Fleet. We've got more than enough force there. We don't need to send anything else. Thank Lord they learned a lesson after this in World War II. They sent everything they've got when they've got the chance. You don't hold stuff back. You don't play gentlemanly warfare. You send everything you can get your mitts on. And honestly, the battle leaves the British with control of the sea still. That still leaves them the command of the ocean. It's what they need. But honestly, as well, neither side got to execute the plan they wanted to. Neither got to execute their strategy, their tactical planning. They didn't. So why did this all happen? Why did this all happen? Well, one of the interesting things you get in the 1920s and 30s is a really substantial growth in wargaming amongst naval officers, but also in exercises. I know it's the standard joke I tend to give about the Royal Navy exercise in 1920s and 30s, that basically it's Atlantic Fleet or Home Fleet, depending on what it's called at that time, and Mediterranean Fleet, take your corners of the Mediterranean, ding the bell, guarded, and take each other out. There is occasionally a loosely scripted scenario, usually about half a page, and yeah, they go for it. And that leads to some really interesting results and some really interesting development. It truly does. And it probably is what best prepares the Royal Navy for what happens. For World War II. Because it teaches them to react to events. To deal with events. But that wasn't the same in World War One. They weren't the same formation. You also have the issues of night fighting and all the other things that build up. Realistically, I would say for both fleets, they are disappointed by Jutland. Both fleets are disappointed by Jutland. Skagerrak, as the Germans call it. Both fleets realised they could have achieved something. For me, it would have been more sensible if the first scouting group had kept going south and had aimed to go past the High Seas Fleet, and the High Seas Fleet get behind the battlecruiser fleet. get behind them so they couldn't run away. It would have been a more complicated maneuver to pull off, and there is always the chance that the cruisers on the wings might spot it happening. But that is the kind of maneuver they needed to pull in order to have a chance to actually do that to the battlecruiser fleet, because they were so much faster than them. The Germans knew the British were faster than them. It's literally, it is in Shear's book. It is in so many other books. They knew. They knew that the British were faster than them. And they didn't. They designed a plan which involved a tail chase. Why? Why? Did they think if they went for Sunderland that the quickest reacting force would be the slowest of the 12-inch battleships? They could have probably done it to them. But no, it's going to be the battlecruiser fleet. That's going to be the one that's going to have. And as for the British, who holds off the Harwich force? Why? Yes, Beatty not communicating does cause massive issues, and it would have brought the battle closer by about an hour. But if you'd also had the Harwich force continuing to head north and engage, the moment the Germans tried to turn away and was blocking them in one of their turns south, that would have caused an absolute nightmare of a battle for the German Navy. As it is, we look at this vessel, we look at Seydlitz, and all I want to do is set up some sort of temple or church or monument of some kind to honour the spirit, the fighting spirit of her crew that got them home. Please note I said honour, not worship, before anyone starts getting that debate in the comment section. But look at them! That vessel literally floated home on will alone. It's getting that close to the water, and this is a picture is taken when it is into calmer waters. Trust me, the North Sea is not that mill pond like and not that nice. We have HMS Spitfire, which goes home with a whole chunk of armour from the Naval on her. Just rocking up, night battle. What did you bring home? Spoils of war? Yeah, this whole chunk of armour plate. She survived. When you look at the ships doing stuff like this, when you look at the battle, I will always stand up for Jellicoe on that front, because Jellicoe, I feel, gets a raw deal, especially with some of the people who want to try and make BT shine better post-war, and with the politicians scapegoating him a lot for things. And he did deliver on it. But the thing is, it's the strategic level that the Admiralty is failing. They haven't got this worked out. Why? Not just the Harwich force, but there are other ships which could be sent. And yes, there is the argument, well, no, they were held back in case the Germans made a break for the Channel. They're not going to make a break for the Channel. Look at where they are. They're up the other wrong end of the frigating North Sea. If they make a break for the Channel, goodbye German High Seas Fleet. It will literally be trying to force the minefield when it's getting pummeled from behind by the Grand Fleet. And by that point, it'll probably be running out of fuel. It's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen. They're still fighting fair in some regards. It's kind of like the same attitude which meant that at the Battle of Trafalgar, there are fleets waiting back in the Channel and further up, that if the Franco-Spanish fleet break through Nelson's fleet, they won't get through that fleet, and they won't get through that fleet. And yes, they were being held in position because they were doing a close blockade as well of those areas. They were doing a close blockade of French ports. They were doing a close blockade of the Channel ports. It makes sense. It makes sense because they're also conducting a close blockade. But the other fleets in this scenario, the Harwich force is not conducting close blockade. It's not. It can move, and it should be moving. And by the way, I do expect massive losses in the Harwich force in that sort of scenario. They would. But the thing is, their losses, and that would have repercussions for the Royal Navy over the next few years, their losses would then, in the nicest way, also mean that the German High Seas Fleet probably gets wiped out as a functioning fighting force. Because any scenario like that, where they do a battle turn and they run straight into that kind of force, and therefore they can't run away, they have to then screen with light forces and turn and maneuver again and change their position, their formation, and just buys time for Jellicoe to slam into them. And look at the damage their ships took. You know, this is one of those areas of warfare where you can really start to look at it in the parts of warfare in history. We start looking and go, the capabilities in terms of the technology have been allowed to replace strategy and tactics. They've all become so obsessed with the technology at their fingertips that they've forgotten about strategy and tactics, and they really aren't applying good principles. And that's a lesson for us today. The technology we have is so amazing, so cool, so absorbing. Yet if it's replacing good tactics, good strategy, good thinking through of what we actually need to do and how it needs to be done, we're in trouble. We really are. And with that being said, I'd like you to think of other battles. Today's question, I always finish the video as a question. Today's question is, think of other battles where that's been the case. Where good tactics and good strategy have been replaced by technology in the pre-war thinking and the pre-war planning. And so when they've ended up in a war, they've had to improvise and relearn those things because they stopped thinking them through. Be really interested to see what you think of. There is one which comes to mind straight away for me not that long ago. Not that long ago. And it's not the Falklands War. But it has been the subject of a fairly decent movie, in that the acting wasn't so bad I didn't want to pull my teeth out, and they did actually remember to reload their magazines. What will come out next week? Philip Vian. Philip Vian. That's going to be fun, and I'm hoping to also finally bring in Emperor Pertinax next week as well. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Take care, and if you like the video, please do like, share, and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow, and this is for all content creators. That bell by the subscribe button, that matters a lot. If that bell is filled in, then you get to choose what you watch of our videos, not YouTube. And that matters. That matters a lot to us. Thank you very much, and take care, and thank you for all your support in making this channel possible. It really does make my life a lot more fun. Take care.